Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher. Today we're going to be talking about the World War II home front. If you went back to December 1941 and you asked someone how they had found out about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, they would be able to tell you in great detail where they were, how they heard the news, and how they felt about it. Interestingly enough, if you ask that same person about Pearl Harbor 10, 20, even 50 years later, they'd probably be able to tell you about where they were and how they learned of the news in the same level of detail. This is what scholars of memory call a flashbulb memory. In other words, a major historical event, newsworthy event that a mass number of people remember very clearly because it was so profoundly earth-shattering or groundbreaking that this memory kind of becomes clearly captured in their brain. Other events in recent American history that also evoke this kind of flashbulb memory, ability to recall where you were, include the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, and then, of course, for younger generations, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So the beginning of World War II for Americans was a major event on the home front. As we discussed in our previous class, most Americans really were trying their best to stay neutral in World War II, to stay out of the war, because of our disappointment with the outcome of World War I and our desire to remain unaffected as the rest of the world was going to war. Once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States ends up declaring war against Japan on December 8th and having Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States in response, now the United States is fully involved in World War II. So for this session, we're going to focus on the home front. What is happening at home in the United States? How are everyday Americans' lives changed by World War II? So World War II is a great example of a concept we call total war. Total war is exactly like it sounds. This is the idea that everything is devoted to winning the war. So this means that the economy is going to drastically shift over away from consumer production towards war production. We're going to have the growth of government agencies to coordinate industry and to plan for materials of war. So, for example, during World War II, we have the War Production Board and the War Manpower Commission that are government agencies that work with labor and businesses to ensure smooth production of war materials. Plants like Ford, where they had been producing cars, shift over to making tanks and airplanes, for example. We're going to have other government agencies like the Office of Price Administration start to regulate rationed goods. So if you wanted to buy things like coffee, sugar, butter, eggs, certain meat, gasoline, metal, rubber, nylons, all of that was regulated to make sure that there was adequate supplies for the war effort and for the troops. This wartime production will be finally what gets the United States out of the Great Depression, as the gross national product, or the annual output economically of the United States, rises from $91 billion a year to $214 billion a year. So total war not only means shifting the economy so that as much resources and materials as possible are earmarked for the war effort so that our troop movements and our military engagements can be successful, but it also oftentimes means drastic changes for your population. A lot more people are going to go to work in factories and plants that produce these war materials, and that's going to mean population movement. So in addition to men who are drafted or men and women who enlist in the armed forces, getting shipped for training to different bases across the United States, we're also going to see people relocating to urban areas like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, specifically to get jobs in wartime industries. And so we're going to have a massive population movement of people. We're also going to have a coordinated response in getting people on board with fighting the war. While a lot of Americans were already very eager to fight Japan, given that the Japanese had attacked American soil at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, for some Americans, going to war against Germany and Italy was a tougher sell. So we're going to see as well a coordinated effort on propaganda. So remember that propaganda is the idea of selling a concept, an idea, a cause to people. Okay, so think of it like ad campaigns for going to war. The United States government is going to issue propaganda through the Office of War Information. So the Office of War Information is going to work together with private companies. For example, Warner Brothers and Walt Disney will both produce propaganda cartoons during World War II. And they're also going to work to publish posters, newsreels, and other kinds of media to really promote American support of World War II. Okay. So a total war really is a profound change in daily life. All resources, your whole life is devoted towards successfully winning this war. This does mean that civilians are seen as equally important as soldiers in war effort. Okay? This is part of the reason why civilians become acceptable targets of war through bombing campaigns, because in a total war, civilian support for the war, whether it's support morale, so emotional support of the war, or physical support of the war through war production, is absolutely crucial. So let's dig into a little bit more what mobilizing for war looks like. Okay, let's talk specifically about how the United States manages to convert their industries from producing consumer products to producing the tools of war. Now, the United States government had already seen the writing on the wall. As we talked about last session, they were really concerned about becoming the arsenal of democracy, even before we officially enter the war, to produce war materials on a larger scale to supply the Allies. And so the United States government had already tried to approach certain industries as early as 1939 to convert to producing more war materials. And initially, a lot of American industries are very reluctant to produce war materials because this means that they would have to undergo very costly conversion. It costs a lot of money, time, and resources to set up the infrastructure so that you're not producing cars, but instead are now producing airplanes. So this was a very costly process to convert from producing domestic products to materials of war. Because of that, the government is going to provide incentives to businesses to encourage them to start this transition to war material production. Governments are going to provide things like lower taxes and low interest loans to businesses to be able to successfully make this transition. But again, most businesses did not take advantage of these perks to convert to wartime production until after Pearl Harbor, in which case many more businesses, now that America was officially at war, started to convert. Now, in order to successfully convert to wartime production, not only did you need to make sure that your workers are compliant, but you also have to deal with labor unions. The government supported the workers in this. They supported the workers' rights to unionize, and they did this because they wanted to exact a promise of either no strikes or limited strikes and walkouts during the war. The number one goal for the government is to produce as many war materials as possible. And to do this, we need to limit work stoppages. So the idea was the government would recognize these unions and get businesses to recognize unions. In exchange, they wanted workers to play nicely and to not walk off the job so we could maintain high production levels. There is a need for more workers during this time. So, this means that the United States is going to start turning increasingly towards populations that didn't have access to these industrial jobs. The draft, where millions of American men are siphoned off into the military, means that there is an acute shortage of workers. And so, this is going to really start to give much more options in terms of jobs and good paying jobs to women and minorities.